They were told the volcano could erupt, but not like this. Not without a countdown. Not on a clear Sunday morning when the sky over Washington was almost painfully blue. And that was why they stayed on the ridge, 5 miles from the crater, watching steam curl upward like it always had for weeks, telling themselves that danger makes noise before it arrives, until the ground shifted beneath their boots in one long rolling motion that did not stop, and the entire north face of the mountain seemed to sag, just slightly, just enough to make the horizon tilt. And in that unnatural silence that followed, before any explosion, before any ash, they understood something vast had already begun moving toward them, and whatever it was faster than they were. May 18th, 1980, near Mount St. Helens, Washington, United States. A clear Sunday morning, the temperature hovering in the low 40s, light wind from the west, visibility almost endless. Snow still clinging to distant ridges while the lower slopes show raw gray scars from weeks of tremors, and Daniel and Laura stand on a narrow overlook about 5 miles north of the crater. Not reckless, not careless, simply convinced that distance equals safety. A paper map folded in Daniel's back pocket, a thermos of coffee resting between rocks, the borrowed camera hanging against his chest, both of them speaking quietly as if the mountain can hear tone. They have followed the news for weeks, heard about the earthquakes, the bulging north face, the warnings that close roads, but never fully explain how far is far enough. And that uncertainty feels manageable in daylight, because the sky is blue, because the air smells only faintly of sulfur, because other cars were parked lower on the access road when they drove up at dawn. And Laura says the plume looks smaller than yesterday while Daniel nods, pretending he believes observation is control. Pretending the stillness in the trees below is calm rather than waiting. The first deep tremor rolls through the ridge without drama, no violent jolt, just a long, bending motion that travels under their boots like a slow wave under a dock. Daniel stiffens. Laura grabs his sleeve, both of them freezing instead of running, because instinct says movement on loose ground is risk, and the tremor stretches longer than the smaller quakes from earlier that week. Longer than comfortable, long enough to make Daniel's camera tap rhythmically against his jacket zipper, long enough for Laura to whisper, "That's not small," without raising her voice. Then the birds rise, not scattered, not random, but all at once from the tree line below. A sudden black surge against the sky, and the silence that follows feels engineered, like the world has removed background noise on purpose. Daniel's heartbeat loud in his ears. Laura scanning the crater rim for visible change, and at first there is none. Only steam curling upward in its usual lazy column, and that almost convinces them to laugh at their own nerves, almost convinces them to pour coffee and wait it out. But the north face shifts, not explosively, not with flame, just a subtle sag that changes the mountain's profile by degrees, enough that Daniel squints and tilts his head, trying to correct it with perspective. And in that fraction of disbelief, the sound arrives, a tearing roar that grows from deep within the earth rather than from above, the air compressing against their chests. A pressure wave that makes Laura stagger backward one step, and in that instant, before ash begins to fall, before the sky darkens, both of them understand the same terrible truth. They are not watching an eruption from a safe distance. They are standing directly in the path of something already moving toward them. Ash falls thicker now. No longer a soft hiss, but a steady, suffocating rain that turns the morning into a dim gray tunnel. And Daniel presses his face into the crook of his elbow, while Laura claws at the shallow depression with shaking hands, trying to deepen it with nothing but urgency and bare fingers. The air tastes metallic. Every breath scratches, and the sky that had been painfully blue less than a minute ago is now erased, replaced by a ceiling of churning gray that moves too fast to be normal weather, too heavy to be simple smoke, and the sound does not stop. It grows, a rolling roar that seems to come from everywhere at once, from above, from beneath, from inside their own chests. Daniel risks lifting his head, just enough to see over the rim of dirt, and what he sees does not make sense at first. The entire north side of the mountain is no longer a shape, but a moving wall, a boiling surge of ash and pulverized rock racing outward, flattening trees in a widening arc. The forest below bends as if pushed by an invisible hand, snapping, folding, vanishing into the advancing cloud. And he understands with a cold clarity that this is not an eruption shooting upward. It is something horizontal, something fast, something aimed directly through the valley they plan to use to return to their car. Laura grips his jacket and shouts something he cannot hear, her voice swallowed by the roar, and he leans close enough to catch the words. "We have to get lower." And it is not panic in her voice, but calculation, because the ridge makes them visible, exposed, and the cut in the earth is shallow protection at best. They look to the left where the ground slopes unevenly toward a cluster of boulders, maybe 20 yards away, maybe less, distance now distorted by falling ash. And Daniel hesitates for half a breath, measuring speed against cover, pride against survival, then nods once and they move. They do not run upright. They crawl and scramble, sliding on loose pumice that shifts like dry sand under their weight, ash thickening on their backs, small stones beginning to strike harder now, tapping against shoulders and helmets, the air hotter with each second, Daniel's lungs burning as he forces himself not to inhale too deeply. Laura stumbles and he grabs her arm, pulls her forward, the roar sharpening into something like tearing metal. And when they finally reach the shadow of the first boulder, they press against its lee side, bodies curled tight, backs to the stone, as the main blast front slams through the ridge above them. The impact is not a single blow, but a sustained force. Wind ripping at their clothes, heat pushing through fabric, ash pouring over the rock in waves that blur the boundary between earth and sky. Daniel counts without meaning to, 1, 2, 3, 4. Waiting for it to lessen, waiting for the world to choose a direction again. But it keeps coming, relentless and blind. And somewhere inside the noise a new fear takes shape. Not of the first blast they survived by inches, but of what follows after a mountain tears itself open, because they are still 5 miles from safety. And the valley they must cross is now a path of moving debris they cannot yet see through. The main blast does not pass quickly. It sustains, it presses, it roars like a freight train that never finishes crossing, and Daniel feels the heat through the back of his jacket as ash pours over the boulder in thick waves, each gust forcing him lower against the ground. Laura's shoulder jammed against his ribs, both of them breathing through fabric that is already damp and clogged. The air so dense it feels chewable. Every inhale a decision that could turn into a cough they cannot afford. And somewhere above the continuous roar comes a sharper cracking sound, timber snapping in sequence, whole stands of trees collapsing as the lateral surge cuts through the valley they were meant to descend. When the first violent push weakens into a steadier wind, Daniel risks lifting his head again, only an inch, only enough to see that the forest line they studied earlier is gone, replaced by a flattened expanse of gray debris pointing away from the mountain like the bristles of a brush, all aligned in the same direction, all forced down at once, and that direction is toward them. He swallows hard and turns to Laura, her eyes red from ash but focused, calculating, and she nods toward the slope behind the boulders where the terrain dips more sharply. Lower ground means thicker air, but also less direct force. And neither of them says what both are thinking, that if another surge comes, they may not outrun it. They move again, crouched and half-crawling, boots slipping in accumulating ash that now lies inches deep, fine as powder yet heavy enough to drag at their legs, the sunlight reduced to a dull amber glow through the cloud, visibility shrinking to maybe 30 yards, maybe less. Distance impossible to judge. Daniel checks his watch out of reflex and sees the second hand still moving, absurdly normal. Time continuing as if the world is not tearing itself open behind them, and that normal motion steadies him for a moment, enough to focus on direction rather than fear. A new tremor ripples underfoot, shorter but sharper, and this time the ground fractures in a narrow line several yards ahead. Not a wide chasm, but enough to remind them the earth itself is unstable. Laura grabs Daniel's arm and pulls him right, away from the crack, her voice hoarse as she shouts that the road below will be buried, that even if the car survives, it will be unreachable, and the implication lands heavy between them. There will be no quick drive out, no easy retreat. Whatever safety exists now lies on foot and under diminishing air. Then the ash thickens again, falling faster, hotter, small stones mixed in like thrown gravel, and Daniel realizes with a tightening in his chest that the first blast was not the whole event, that the eruption is continuing, column rising, debris spreading, and the valley that once felt like a path home is becoming a funnel of debris and heat. Laura grips his hand, not out of panic but resolve, and points toward a darker shape barely visible through the haze, a shallow ravine cutting across the slope, deeper cover if they can reach it, and without another word they angle toward it, knowing every step now is a wager against distance, wind, and time. The ravine is narrower than it looked through the ash, its sides steep but not sheer, carved by seasonal runoff that now carries only gray slurry sliding past their boots, and Daniel nearly falls as the ground gives way under a crust of cooling debris, Laura catching him by the strap of his pack and pulling him down beside her, both of them crouched below the ridge line as another surge of hot wind rolls overhead, louder than the last, filled with a grinding undertone that vibrates through bone rather than air, and they press their backs into the damp soil, grateful for the depth, terrified of what might fill it next. For a moment the wind shifts direction, curling downward into the cut where they hide, bringing with it thicker ash that coats their hair and eyelashes, and breathing becomes work measured in shallow pulls. Daniel tearing a strip from the inside of his shirt to double the layer over his mouth, Laura copying him without speaking, their movements synchronized not from calm but from necessity, and through the dim light they see fragments of bark and splintered branches tumbling past the ravine's edge, carried by forces they cannot see, reminders that the forest above them is being erased in real time. The roar eases slightly, not silence but distance, as if the main body of the eruption has shifted direction, and Daniel dares to climb 2 steps up the ravine wall to look beyond it, the view barely recognizable, the once green valley replaced by a flat, smoking plain streaked with fallen trunks aligned like matchsticks. And farther out a darker mass moves low across the ground, not as tall as the earlier blast, but denser, rolling outward in a spreading arc. And he feels his stomach tighten because that movement is not vertical ash. It is ground-hugging debris that follows terrain, that fills low spaces, that chooses ravines like this one as its path. He slides back down and meets Laura's eyes. No need for explanation. Both of them understanding that the cover they chose may soon become a trap, and the decision forms between them without words. Stay and risk being buried or climb and risk exposure. Fear pulling in one direction, logic in another, and Daniel feels anger rise sharp and sudden. Anger at the mountain, at himself, at the casual way they treated distance as protection. But anger is energy, and he uses it, nodding toward the higher slope beyond the ravine, where scattered rock outcrops might deflect the worst of the flow. They move before doubt can slow them, scrambling up the far side as the ground trembles again. Smaller shocks now, but frequent. Ash sliding underfoot like loose sand, lungs burning from effort and air that offers no comfort, and halfway up the slope a deep rumble grows louder from behind. Not overhead this time, but from the valley floor. And when Daniel glances back, he sees the darker mass entering the ravine they just left, filling it with a churning mix of ash and debris, swallowing the hollow that would have hidden them minutes earlier, and the sight sends a cold clarity through him. Survival here is not about finding shelter once. It is about moving before the mountain decides where the next path will be. They reach the higher slope breathless, ash sliding under their boots in soft collapses that threaten to pull them backward. And Daniel feels the heat rising from the ground through the soles, as if the mountain itself is exhaling beneath them. Laura coughing once, sharply, then forcing herself still, saving air, saving strength, because panic burns oxygen faster than running. and below them the ravine they escaped is no longer visible, swallowed by a rolling gray current that moves with frightening patience, not rushing like a wave, but advancing like something that knows it will reach everything eventually. The light shifts again, turning from amber to a deeper rust color as the ash column thickens overhead. The sun reduced to a faint disk that offers no warmth, only a dull glow that makes distance impossible to judge. And Daniel squints toward where the access road should be, trying to picture the switchbacks they studied on the map. But the landscape has flattened into sameness, familiar landmarks erased, trees stripped and leveled, ridges softened by fresh deposits, and he realizes with a tightening in his chest that navigation now is memory against ruin, guesswork against change. A sharp cracking sound draws their attention uphill, and both freeze as a cluster of weakened trees finally gives way, trunks snapping and sliding downslope in a sudden cascade, not large enough to crush them from this distance, but close enough to send a spray of debris scattering. And Laura grabs Daniel's sleeve, pulling him behind a jagged outcrop just as a rain of splinters and stones skips across the slope where they had been standing seconds earlier. The randomness of it worse than the blast itself, because there is no clear front line, no single direction to face. The tremors continue in irregular pulses, some faint, some strong enough to make them brace, and with each one small avalanches of ash spill from higher ground, whispering downward in soft, dangerous slides that could bury ankles, then knees, then more. And Daniel forces himself to scan constantly, not just ahead but above, calculating angles, reading the way loose material shifts, while Laura counts their remaining water in short, practical phrases, half a bottle each, maybe less after the dust they have swallowed, and the fact lands heavy between them. The eruption may slow, the ash may settle, but thirst will not wait. Another low rumble grows from behind, not as violent as before, but steady, sustained. And when Daniel risks a glance back, he sees a new plume rising from the crater, darker than the first, and he understands that what they have survived so far is only the beginning phase, that the mountain is still adjusting, still releasing pressure in waves, and the path down the slope they are climbing may soon be cut off by fresh debris. Laura meets his gaze, eyes rimmed red but steady, and says quietly through cloth and dust that they cannot keep moving blindly uphill. They need direction. They need a fixed point. And for the first time since the blast began, Daniel feels the weight of leadership settle fully on him. Because choosing wrong now does not mean inconvenience. It means vanishing into a landscape that is rewriting itself with every passing minute. Daniel chooses a direction not because he is certain, but because standing still feels worse. He points toward a line of darker rock formations angling away from the crater, higher ground that may shield them from lateral surges and keep them above any flowing debris. And Laura nods without argument, the simplicity of agreement cutting through fear, because hesitation now costs more than mistakes, and together they angle across the slope instead of climbing straight up. Boots sinking ankle-deep in ash that shifts like dry flour. Every step deliberate, every breath measured through cloth that grows heavier with trapped dust. The tremors change rhythm, no longer sharp pulses but rolling vibrations that last longer, subtle but constant, and Daniel feels them through his knees and palms as he steadies himself against the incline, the mountain no longer exploding outward but settling, adjusting, sending smaller releases that still carry weight and heat, and behind them the air thickens again with a fresh wave of falling ash, larger particles striking their shoulders with soft taps, accumulating on their backs until Laura shakes hers off with a quick motion, knowing added weight steals energy they cannot spare. Halfway toward the rock line, the wind shifts sharply from the north, pushing the ash cloud sideways and reducing visibility to almost nothing, the world shrinking to a gray corridor no wider than their outstretched arms. And Daniel feels the edge of panic rise when he loses sight of the outcrop for several seconds, direction dissolving into monotony. Laura's voice cutting through the roar as she tells him to stop, to wait, to let the gust pass rather than wander blind into a depression they cannot see, and they crouch together, backs touching so neither drifts away, counting slowly until the air thins just enough to reveal the darker shapes ahead once more. When they finally reach the first of the rocks, its surface already dusted thick and warm, they press against it and scan downhill, and the sight is both relief and warning. The lower valley now almost entirely obscured by a spreading gray blanket, faint plumes still rising where heat escapes, and the access road invisible beneath fresh deposits, which means rescue, if it comes, will not follow familiar paths. And Laura says quietly that even if helicopters fly, they may not see two figures coated head to toe in ash unless they move to open ground, unless they create contrast, unless they are still alive long enough to try. Another distant boom echoes from the crater, less violent than before, but heavy, sustained. And Daniel understands that the eruption is entering a prolonged phase, not a single event, but a sequence. Ash continuing to fall, tremors likely to persist, daylight fading early under the thickening cloud, and the realization tightens around them both. Survival now is not about outrunning a blast, but enduring a changed environment, finding breathable air, conserving water, choosing elevation that keeps them safe from flows yet visible from above. And as the first hints of afternoon darkness creep into what should still be morning, they both know the hardest test has only just begun. The ash continues to fall, slower now but thicker, settling into every crease of fabric, every fold of skin, turning Daniel and Laura into gray figures against a gray world. And the wind that once roared now moves in heavy breaths, gusting hard and then dropping without warning, each lull more frightening than the noise because silence suggests another shift is coming. And Daniel studies the rock line stretching farther east, realizing that staying pressed against one outcrop is not enough. They need elevation and visibility, but not the skyline where exposure is total. A balance between shelter and signal that feels impossible to calculate in a landscape still rearranging itself. Laura checks the thermos, not for coffee but for weight, and the absurdity almost makes her laugh. The warmth inside long gone, yet the metal container still useful as a sound tool, something that could strike rock, something that could create rhythm if aircraft pass overhead. And she says this out loud, forcing practicality into the space between them, and Daniel nods, scanning the sky through the ash veil for any movement that is not debris, any shape that holds intention. But the cloud ceiling remains dense, daylight reduced to a dim copper glow that feels closer to dusk than late morning. A fresh tremor ripples through the slope, stronger than the last few, knocking loose a sheet of ash above them that slides downward in a slow, suffocating cascade. And Daniel shoves Laura sideways as the flow brushes past their boots, burying them to mid-calf before they wrench free. The material deceptively light yet heavy enough in volume to trap if they hesitate. And the lesson lands hard. They cannot linger on inclines where accumulation builds. They need firmer ground, exposed rock that sheds ash instead of holding it. They push higher along the rock line, breath shallow, legs burning from constant resistance. And as they crest a minor rise, the view opens slightly to the south where the sky looks marginally lighter. The ash cloud thinning just enough to reveal faint outlines of distant ridges. And for the first time since the blast began, Daniel feels a thin thread of direction. If the wind continues shifting that way, visibility may improve, and aircraft, if launched from safer zones, would likely approach from that clearer corridor. But hope is dangerous when built on wind patterns they cannot control. Then a distant chopping sound trembles faintly through the air, almost lost in the settling ash, and both freeze, listening past their own breathing, and there it is again. Irregular but mechanical. Not the mountain, not falling timber, something else. And Laura grips Daniel's arm with sudden intensity, eyes wide not with relief but with urgency, because sound alone is not rescue. Sound means opportunity, and opportunity means they must move into a position where they can be seen. And as the faint rotor echo grows slightly clearer through the thinning haze, they realize the next decision could determine whether they remain two shapes swallowed by ash, or become two figures impossible to ignore. The rotor sound grows clearer but never steady, swallowed and revealed again by drifting ash, and Daniel steps out from the shelter of the rocks despite Laura's instinct to pull him back, because being safe and being seen are no longer the same thing, and he climbs the last exposed stretch toward a narrow crest where the slope flattens briefly, ash sliding under his boots with each step, his lungs aching from the thin, dust-filled air. The sky above still the color of rusted metal, visibility barely stretching a few hundred yards in any direction. And when he reaches the crest, he turns slowly, scanning for movement that does not belong to the mountain. Laura joins him seconds later, both of them standing in open exposure now, silhouettes against a landscape that looks erased, and the rotor noise returns. Louder this time, distinct, mechanical, approaching from the south where the ash cloud thins slightly, but there is still no visible aircraft, only shifting curtains of gray that conceal and reveal in uneven waves, and Daniel feels the urgency tighten in his chest, because if the helicopter passes even a mile off course, they will be invisible against this monochrome ruin. Laura drops her pack and yanks free the emergency blanket she insisted on bringing, its metallic surface dulled by ash but still reflective, and together they shake it hard, sending gray powder cascading off in thick sheets, then stretch it wide between them, angling it toward the lighter sky, and Daniel bangs the thermos against the rock in sharp, rhythmic strikes, metal on stone, again and again, ignoring the sting in his hands, creating pattern instead of chaos, something deliberate in a world that has turned random. For a long second, nothing changes. The rotor sound fades slightly as if the aircraft is veering away, and a wave of despair hits Daniel so sharply it almost buckles his knees. The thought that this chance is slipping, that the mountain will swallow the noise just as it swallowed the road and the forest and the ravine. And Laura shouts through her mask for him to keep striking, to keep the blanket high, to not assume absence means abandonment. And he forces his arm to continue the rhythm. 3 hard strikes. Pause. 3 hard strikes. Over and over. A signal carved into sound. Then the ash curtain parts just enough, and through the thinning gray they catch a brief, unmistakable silhouette. A helicopter banking slightly, searching, its shape flickering in and out of a view. And Laura angles the blanket higher while Daniel increases the tempo of his strikes, their bodies exposed on the crest, wind whipping the foil sheet violently, ash swirling around their legs, and the aircraft shifts again, turning more directly toward their position, not yet committed, not yet descending, but no longer passing by. And in that suspended, breathless moment, they understand survival. Now depends on holding this ground long enough for the pilot to choose them over the chaos below. The helicopter circles once, uncertain, buffeted by unstable air rising from the heated ground, its rotor wash scattering ash into spirals that blur its own visibility, and Daniel keeps striking the thermos against the rock until his hand goes numb. The rhythm uneven now but persistent, while Laura braces her feet wide and holds the emergency blanket high despite the wind snapping it like a sail, the metallic surface flashing faintly each time the ash thins, and for a terrible second, the aircraft drifts sideways again, half lost behind a moving curtain of gray. Then the pilot commits, banking sharply toward the ridge, lowering altitude in cautious increments, and the sound swells into a physical force pressing against their chests, ash blasting outward in violent sheets as the rotor wash tears at the crest, forcing Daniel to drop to one knee while still waving an arm. Laura crouching but refusing to release the blanket, because letting go now would mean disappearing back into sameness, and the helicopter hovers just off the ridgeline, unable to land on unstable ash, forced to hold position in turbulent air. A door slides open, a figure inside leaning out with a bright harness line coiled at his feet, gestures sharp and urgent, pointing downward to indicate they must move closer to the hover point, and Daniel grabs Laura's wrist, both of them scrambling across the crest against the blast of wind, ash whipping into their eyes and mouths, despite cloth barriers, each step uncertain as the loose surface shifts under the force of the rotors, and when they reach the indicated spot, the crewman drops the line, its hook swinging wildly in the turbulence. Laura catches it first, but nearly loses balance as the wind shoves her sideways, Daniel anchoring her with both arms while she secures the harness around her waist with shaking fingers, the metal cold and slick with dust. And for a split second they lock eyes. No words possible in the noise, only understanding. She goes first, and when she signals ready, the line snaps taut and lifts her abruptly off the ground, her boots clearing the ash as she rises through the swirling gray toward the open door, shrinking against the vast ruined slope below. Daniel watches until she disappears inside, relief colliding with fresh fear, because now he stands alone on the crest, exposed, the helicopter straining to hold steady as ash thickens again in sudden gusts, the line dropping back toward him in a swinging arc, and he moves forward into the rotor wash, squinting against the blast, heart hammering not from exertion but from the fragile timing of it all, because the mountain is still rumbling beneath his feet, the eruption not finished, the air not stable, and the window for extraction measured not in minutes but in moments that can close without warning. The line swings toward Daniel in a wide, violent arc, ash slicing across his face in stinging sheets, the helicopter shuddering in place as unstable air rises from the heated slopes below, and he steps forward into the blast, both hands reaching, missing once, then catching the hook on the second swing, fingers clamping down with a force born from pure refusal to be left behind, the metal vibrating in his grip as he pulls the harness around his waist, movements clumsy and gloves coated with grit, every second stretched thin by the rumble still pulsing beneath his boots. A fresh tremor rolls through the ridge, stronger than the last few, and the crest shifts subtly under him, ash breaking loose in a sliding wave that pours past his ankles, and for one suspended instant, he fears the ground will give entirely before the line tightens, fears he will be dragged sideways instead of upward. But the crewman above yanks hard on the cable, signaling lift, and the tension snaps through the harness, cutting into his hips as his boots leave the surface, the ash below exploding outward in chaotic spirals from the rotor wash. As he rises, the landscape opens beneath him in a view both vast and ruined. The once green forest flattened into gray lines radiating from the crater, smoke and steam curling from scattered vents, the access road buried and unrecognizable, and in that expanding distance, Daniel feels a sharp wave of anger dissolve into something heavier, a humbled awareness of scale, of how small two careful people are against a mountain adjusting its shape, and yet how fiercely small lives insist on continuing, on signaling, on choosing not to surrender to silence. The helicopter door yawns closer, hands reaching down to grab his jacket and haul him inside with abrupt, practiced force, the line unhooked in seconds, the door sliding shut against the ash-choked wind, and suddenly the noise changes from exposed roar to enclosed vibration, still loud but contained, Laura lunging forward to grip his shoulders as if confirming solidity, both of them coated in gray, eyes red, lungs raw, yet unmistakably alive. The aircraft banking south toward clearer air where the sky regains a pale hint of blue beyond the spreading cloud. As they gain distance, the mountain remains in motion behind them, ash column rising higher, the eruption far from finished. But survival for them has shifted from endurance to aftermath, from immediate danger to the slow realization of what was lost and what was kept. And Daniel leans back against the metal interior, breath finally deep enough to fill his chest without burning, understanding that rescue did not come because they were fearless or lucky alone, but because in the worst moments they chose movement over paralysis, signal over silence, each small decision stacking against the mountain's force. And though the landscape below is forever changed, the simple fact of breath, shared and steady, feels like a victory carved from ash. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to read more survival stories.